She's a known public intellectual and one of the outstanding economists of our country. And she played a very pivotal role, I believe, in the development of West Bengal Human Development Report. And for us, those in the state of Andhra Pradesh and now in Telangana and Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh, she headed this commission for farmers' distress, and she wrote a beautiful report on the nature and the causes of the agrarian distress that prevailed in undivided Andhra Pradesh at the turn of the century and around 2000. I don't know how far the governments have been able to implement the recommendation. So I request you present your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Suri. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's wonderful that here in Hyderabad, the Hyderabad Collective is organizing something like this, and that so many of you are willing to come here and spend the day talking about these matters. So thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this. I think Professor Suri has already identified many of the important issues that I want to touch on, and so I'm really going to develop several of these. But I just want to begin by pointing out something which I noticed there are many young people in the audience, and probably several of them, most of you were born after liberalization had begun, if you like, you were born in the neoliberal era. And if you actually grew up in the neoliberal era, then there's a kind of dominant narrative in the press, which is that there were these terrible dark ages before where the state controlled everything and you couldn't get telephones and you couldn't get cars. I mean, forget mobile phones, of course, didn't exist, but generally there was this terrible technological dark ages with the heavy hand of the state controlling everything. And then we had liberalization, and suddenly there was this flowering of Indian capital and entrepreneurship, and we got Infosys, and we got, you name it, and all the good stuff. And we got international credit cards. I mean, this is the kind of middle class narrative that is very, very prevalent. I think what's important a little bit is to set the record straight. First, in terms of what the neoliberal era has meant in terms of state involvement. Okay? So there's this whole perception that, before there was heavy state involvement which kind of controlled everything, and now we are free from all of that. We really don't, the state has withdrawn from a large number of areas. It's no longer regulating, it's no longer there in public enterprises in such a way, so it has withdrawn. Actually, this is a misnomer, this is wrong. This is not what has happened. Neoliberalism does not imply a withdrawal of the state, okay? What it does imply is that the state is no longer fundamentally concerned about the rights of the citizens. It is more concerned about the rights of capital. If you had to think of one difference of neoliberalism, it's really that. It is not that, the state is not important. The state is more important than ever. And in many, many different ways, and probably in many overarching ways that also affect many things that were not controlled when I was young, when I was your age. Okay? What neoliberalism does is to shift the focus of the state from perceiving a responsibility towards meeting the rights of citizens to one that is focused on encouraging capital. Okay? Now, this is not necessarily because everybody who's doing it is mana fide and they want to do bad things and there's a big conspiracy of capital and a few people running the government and so on. It's not because of that. It is really rather based on a particular perception of what drives economic growth and economic development. Okay? And the perception is broadly like this, that you will really get a modern economy rapid economic growth, diversification and all that by allowing large private capital to do what it can. Because it's large private capital that can give you formal jobs, that can give you the benefits of economies of scale, that can compete with global capital, that can actually change the structure of the economy. Okay? So if you want those things, you have to encourage large private capital. Encouraging large private capital means easing the conditions for their operations, or what is now called the ease of doing business, for which in fact you even have indices and publications that tell you which country is better at providing ease of doing business. Ease of doing business is not just about no red tape and all of that. It's really about ensuring the right incentives for capital. And a lot of the last 25 years have been about ensuring the incentives. I'll talk a little bit more about this, how and what it's meant in a minute. But it's about this. So the basic argument is, if we want all the good stuff that economic development is supposed to generate, which is proper formal sector jobs, high rates of growth, decent incomes for everybody and all of those things, then we have to actually incentivize large corporate private capital, because they're the ones who can give this to us. They will invest, that will generate more output, more economic activity, more jobs, and so on and so forth. And so we will do whatever it takes to actually give that outcome. It's not entirely mala fide, if you see what I mean. There's a vision in there. It's not a vision I agree with, but there is that vision. It's that vision which in turn generated certain promises of the neoliberal era. Okay? And I think Professor Suri already beautifully identified those promises. So let me just elaborate a little bit on what he said. First promise, definitely economic growth. That we will actually provide these incentives in the form of easing the rules and restrictions for large capital, not necessarily small capital, and providing them incentives. We will then get more investment and higher growth. Okay? So, first promise. Second promise, this growth will give us more and better jobs. That was a very important part of it. I know for the young today, it feels like the employment situation has never been so bad, but it was pretty bad even then. You are right, I'm afraid, that it has never been as bad as this. But it was bad even then. So the idea was that we need this growth to give us more jobs and better quality jobs. Not the horrible informal sector employment at below subsistence wages with terrible working conditions and all of that, but proper formal jobs. Okay? It also promised economic diversification. That is, we will not have everybody stuck in what was seen to be low productivity, agriculture, or low productivity. People will move on to jobs that actually generate more value, whether as employees or as self-employed. So that was the third promise, that you will actually get economic diversification. And of course, all of this was going to be accompanied, as Professor Suri mentioned, by greater efficiency. It wasn't just corruption, it was that, we have all these public sector and private sector companies that are inefficient because they don't face competition. We have these big fat ambassador cars that nobody else in the world uses. We have all these other clunky machines and so on. So we will now get efficient companies that will actually be forced to become more productive and to use more rational, more systematic methods, because otherwise they will not be able to compete. So these were the promises. And of course, associated with efficiency was that you would get a rise in what I would call aggregate labor productivity. What does that mean? It means that labor productivity is how productive workers are. But remember, workers can be very productive in a company which is, let's say, a very modern company using the latest technology and the latest machines. But they may not be as productive if they're forced to produce another similar product, but using very, very basic machinery and technology and so on. So the idea was we would improve the aggregate productivity of everybody, not just of a few small enclaves that nobody, that don't have an impact on the rest of the economy, but for the entire economy, we will improve aggregate labor productivity. So at least in economic terms, let's say there were these 5 promises. Okay? To what extent have they been met? Growth we got, no question about it. Absolutely, we got a higher rate of economic growth. Okay? We moved from the so-called Hindu rate of growth of 3% to 5% in the 1980s. So we got to about 6.5% in the 1990s, to about 7.5% on average in the 2000s. And of course, now we're all crying because we have to reach double digits, otherwise we don't feel macho enough. The growth rate has to be, more than China for sure, and then we can all beat our breath and say terrific. But it has to be in double digits to prove that we're really growing fast. Okay? So yes, we got income growth. If we get employment generation, and here is the shock. Why is it a shock? It's a shock, let me tell you, it's not just a shock to all of us, it's a shock to economists. It's a shock to me. It's a shock to even Cassandras like me who didn't think this was a strategy that worked. The extent to which it has not generated jobs is historically unprecedented. Okay? We are the only economy in the world and through history that has grown for more than 6% per annum for 25 years without any increase in formal employment. Unprecedented. It never happened. Okay? And it's not just that, but we didn't even generate the kinds of jobs that are informal and not so desirable. In other words, we've had a very weird kind of economic growth. We've had massive expansion of income, massive by standards of the previous decade, but without job growth. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Indian employment data, but I should tell you that we have a very generous definition of what employment is. Okay? So our national sample surveys, they talk about different kinds of employment. Primary status, subsidiary status, what you do over the whole year, what you do in any one week, what you do over a month, different definitions. But we will describe all kinds of things as economic activity. So, for example, if I really don't have a job, I live in a farm but there's not much work around for me to do, but I do go out and milk the cow every morning. Okay? Then I am regularly employed in a subsidiary activity. So I will be counted among workers. Supposing I'm in an urban area, and again, I have absolutely no source of living or employment. I'm basically living in my parental home. I cannot find a job anywhere. So I actually get a job washing cars every morning. And I spend maybe 1 hour washing 3 or 4 different cars in the morning. Regularly employed. Primary activity. Okay, so we have a very, very generous notion of employment. Now imagine, with this incredibly loose and generous notion of employment, guess what the rate of growth of employment has been over the past 25 years when our GDP is growing, as you know, at this really dramatic rate? 2%. Unbelievable but true. We're not talking about formal. Formal is 0. Formal employment, no growth at all. All this other stuff, only 2%. And the most remarkable thing, female employment has actually fallen in the last 10 years. Which, again, doesn't seem plausible, doesn't seem real. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. Now, this, as I said, is historically unprecedented, but it tells us that there's something really strange about the Indian growth pattern. Okay? It's not a normal, even a normal capitalist growth pattern. There's something peculiar going on in this economy, and we need to uncover what exactly it is. Okay, so that's the job part of the promise. What about economic diversification? Now remember, that was another promise, that you're moving away from low productivity agriculture, low productivity services, like the fellows with the bananas on the cart, or the people washing the cars in the urban areas, and like all the hundreds of millions of agriculturalists who are forced to keep on operating sometimes with negative incomes from farming. Okay? So we were going to move people out of that Not throw them out, that is not force them out of agriculture, but move them out because better jobs, higher paying jobs would be available in the other sector. Again, remarkable, again we are unusual. We are a country which has been growing this rapidly, where the share of industry in both output and employment has stagnated, hasn't increased at all over these 30 years, where the share of employment in industry has stagnated, hasn't increased, and is very, very low compared to all the other countries, BRICS, G20, whichever group we want to be part of, we are the lowest. Okay? And where the share of the primary sector, that is farming, fishing, and so on, the primary sector's share of employment is close to 60%. It barely budged for 50 years. It was 70%. It's come down to just under 60%. So most people still stuck in primary activities, but the share of the primary sector in national income, okay, which is an indication of how well you're doing in there, what kinds of income you get, the share of the primary sector in national income was about 50% 50 years ago. Now it's come down to 15%, 1-5. So here you have almost 60% of your population, of your workforce, stuck in activities that give you only 15% of your national income. Think of what that means for the relative incomes in society. One thing it tells you for sure, this growth is not going to those who are fundamentally engaged in the primary sector, which includes, by the way, the farmers who produce not just our food, but the raw materials for industry and all of that. And Biraj will have more to tell you about all of those issues. So diversification also didn't happen. And let me tell you, that too is a surprise for us economists. Because however much you may dislike a particular pattern of growth, supposing I said I didn't like it what they did in South Korea because it was done under a dictatorship with no recognition of workers' rights, and it was all terrible and so on, but they managed the diversification. In China, high rates of growth, diversification. The share of workers in agriculture has fallen sharply. Okay? So, in other words, most countries that grow like this, whether neoliberal or not, they do achieve the diversification. We didn't. Okay, so second strange result. What about greater efficiency and higher labor productivity? Now here again there's a conundrum. Okay? At one level, if you look at aggregate labor productivity, it's growing very fast in India. Why? Because GDP is rising and the workforce isn't growing much. Right? So clearly there's a relative increase in productivity. If you look at just our aggregate figures, and if you look, if you're comparing across nations, you'll say, oh, India is doing very well. But here's the thing, it's not really, it's a very peculiar growth. We have some pockets of very high productivity. Okay? That's some industries, the large formal industries, and especially the ones that are very capital intensive, that require very little labor for a lot of massive machinery. Some obvious things are petrochemicals, now increasingly the steel, the large basic goods, electrical, all of those things, those actually are very high labor productivity sectors. We also have very high labor productivity services now. Telecom, for example, which is one of the fastest growing services in terms of economic activity, in terms of share of income, but it's not growing at all in terms of share of employment because you don't need too many workers in telecoms. Okay? It's a different kind of service provision. So you have a set of what you could call the sort of showpiece, modern stuff. Okay? And then you have this massive area which is in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in services, in all the sectors, of very, very low productivity. And that accounts for the bulk of our workers, even in industry. In other words, in industry, if you actually look within sectors and across, you will find that the high productivity sectors account for maybe 5% of total employment. 95% of employment, even in industry, is in sectors which on average don't show much productivity because they're full of these small, tiny micro enterprises or informal enterprises that really operate with very little capital. And if you go even further down into that data, if you look at the NSS enterprise surveys and you look at the census of enterprise, you get an even bigger shock. I had a student who actually did that. She looked at what has been happening over time to these small and micro enterprises. And guess what? Productivity is falling. They are less productive today. There are more people having to produce the same, and often these are very low-grade things, okay? There are soaps, there is this, there is that, there are all kinds of things. So we have a very peculiar system where in fact productivity hasn't increased, even though the aggregate story suggests it has. Most of our workers are still employed in very, very low productivity activities, in services, in agriculture, in industry, across the board. And that's because the modern, the shiny, modern 21st century stuff just doesn't generate enough jobs. Okay? As I'm sure the young people here know to their cost, that's really the problem. That when you can get a job, it's faster time, it's short term, it's contract, or it's just not there. You're told to get up and stand up and start up and so on, right? Which basically means you have to become your own micro enterprise. It's an opting out on the part of the government. Okay, so these promises we didn't get. Now, there's another, I'll come back to the issue of the employment. But first we need to understand, well then what on earth was going on? How come we got all this, 7 to 10%? Why are we now, what is the word the IMF chief used? Christine Lagarde said we are the one bright spot in a dark global economy. Now, I swear to you, she has deep myopia if she thinks this is a bright spot. Because, clearly, you're just so desperate that you will grab at anything, and if it's a GDP number that suits you, then go grab it. Okay, what was this growth? How come we got so much high growth? And was it related to the neoliberal regime, or were we just lucky? Was it the global context? What happened? In fact, it was the neoliberal regime. Definitely, let us give credit where it's due. It was very clearly this shift in policy stance, this change in the nature of the state that has given us this higher growth. How? Essentially, two things happened. One is that you have a state which is openly and explicitly going out there to give incentives to capital. Okay? And these incentives can happen in many ways. They can happen in terms of giving cheap land, which a lot of which has been given over the last 25 years. Cheap mineral resources, huge amount has been given. People talk about, mining in Odisha. But the famous example of the Mukta and Panna oil fields, which was given away to the Ambanis, to one Ambani at one point, and which have effectively meant that the resources that belong to the Indian people are now privatized, and the Indian people are forced to pay very, very high rates. Otherwise, they will just keep it in the ground and wait for the benefit of access to these resources. Whether it is cheap forests, whether it is water, there have been many cases of even rivers being privatized, but certainly, a whole range of access to natural resources is one form of incentive. Then there are fiscal incentives. So direct taxes to GDP and corporation taxes as a share of national income, we have one of the lowest ratios again in the world. Okay? Certainly the lowest among the BRICS countries, the lowest among the G20 countries, the lowest among, which are the other things we want to be on? The Security Council, we'll be one of the lowest ratios there. Whichever club we want to be in, we are at the bottom. It's a bit like us at the Olympics, okay? We are not good at this thing. Okay, so low tax GDP ratio, why? Because you don't want to tax corporations. You want to incentivize them, so you're giving them many fiscal benefits. In addition to that, my friend Sainath, whom you're going to hear later, keeps doing these estimates every budget of how much we have given away in taxes forgone. I don't know why he does it, it just adds to his blood pressure and everything, but we give away huge amounts. Latest one, I think, was more than 6% of GDP in the latest budget, which is many times our fiscal deficit. No, it's much more than our fiscal deficit. It is about 30 times what we're spending on the employment guarantee. It is about 20 times what we would spend on food security and so on. Okay? So we give away a lot in taxes. We give them other incentives, for example, in changing rules and in turning a blind eye to the informality that is prevalent even in the formal sector. Okay, this is another thing I wanted to just bring your attention to in case you're not familiar with the statistics. What is formal employment, right? Now, formal employment, many people would think would be, the kind of job I have, a job in the university with a proper, salary and everything is all recognized and formal, and it gives me access to many things like a bank account and so on. And most people in the world would see that as formal employment. But oh no, not us. We have, again, a very generous view of what formal employment is. Okay? Very expansive definition. So what's the definition of a formal worker in India? You have to have any one of these three things. Not all, any one. A written contract. Okay? If you just have a written contract, you're a formal worker. Never mind if it's implemented or not. But if you have a written contract, you're a formal worker. Any kind of paid leave. Any kind of paid leave makes you a formal worker, even if you don't have a written contract. Okay? As I said, there are three separate categories. You just have to meet any one criterion. Or three, any kind of social security. So, a pension, health insurance, any other benefit, anything like that makes you a formal worker. Okay? So imagine, we have the loosest definition of formal work in the world. I haven't checked Pakistan, but in South Asia, once again, we're the worst. Even Nepal is better. Okay. So, very, very loose definition of formal work. Guess how many of our workers are formal by this very loose definition? Any guess? 20%? 6, 4. You're right, it was 6 25 years ago. What neoliberalism has done has brought us down to 4% of our workers are now formal workers. That means they have any one of these three pathetic things. So even these formal workers wouldn't really be called formal workers in most other countries, but even then they are this tiny, tiny minority. The ones that our labor laws are, apparently so restrictive that we just don't allow employers and industrialists to function because they have to deal with all these terrible labor laws. Yeah, really? 4% of the workforce? Okay. And in fact, formal enterprises, that is to say organized enterprises, both public and private, use less and less of workers with any one of these criteria. In other words, the share of formal workers in formal enterprises is falling. And now it is basically only around 60%. So 40% of the workers in formal enterprises are informal. They're daily wages. They're short-term contract people who do not have any rights. And this proportion has risen dramatically in the neoliberal period. So, this is another outcome that is unexpected. So, what's the nature of the growth that could do this? Well, basically, what this did in the first instance was to provide cheap resources, cheap fiscal incentives, etc. In the 1990s, this worked, but not that much. It wasn't a massive growth phase, okay? The big growth phase, as you all know, happens from 2002 onwards. That's when the economy, I forget the phrase, hit the ground running and, blah, blah, blah. It did all these wonderful things so that we were growing very dramatically. What happened? Well, what happened was the delayed effect of financial liberalization. Okay? So in 1993-94, the government brought into place a whole range of things that liberalized the rules for the entry of finance and which allowed for a lot of deregulation of finance inside the country. Okay? But 1993, you see, the thing about financial liberalization liberalization is that you can do everything to attract the capital, but it's up to the capital whether it comes or not. Okay? And that decision is not normally made in your own country. It's happening with a whole bunch of other things going on. What happened to us that in 1993-94, in the mid-90s, we did this, we threw the party, but nobody came. Okay. However, 2000-2001, there was a global recession. A lot of emerging markets in Asia already had crisis. You remember the Asian financial crisis of 97-98? After that, there was a crisis in Mexico, then in Argentina, and so on. So then in Russia. So lots of these developing countries and emerging markets had financial crises. Global capital is looking for a place that hasn't had a crisis for a while. And in fact, we hadn't had a financial crisis ever. We were really special. Plus, potentially a large economy, potentially massive markets, a finance minister who is, beloved of global finance. So we had all these trappings of success, if you like. And so global capital decided to discover us. It's those who want to track this in future, please look at some of the other indicators that tell you things about it. But there are straws in the wind for what's happening with the economy. Whenever a finance minister hits the cover of Euro money, or is complimented by the IMF chief, or is given Best Finance Minister of the World award by Business Week, then you know that your country is either on the verge of being discovered or will be discovered. About 7 to 10 years after this discovery by global finance, that country will have a financial crisis. I can write it down for you. I have looked at 71 developing country crises. This is the pattern everywhere. Okay, so what happened? We got discovered. Round about 2003, we got massive inflows. Now remember, this is a period when the global economy is also booming. Yeah? So global trade is up, China is entering in a big way and generating a lot of trade and demanding more of our goods and so on and so forth. The global economy in general is on an upswing and finance needs a place to go. So they put a little bit of their portfolio into India. For them it's a little bit, maybe 1%, 2%, not a lot. For us it's huge. For us it's a massive inflow. We go from 2 billion inflow to 80 billion inflow. Okay? Dollars I'm talking about. It's a massive, massive entry into the economy. Now what this entry of finance does is to make capital very cheap in India. It's very easy to borrow, it's very easy to get you equity. The stock market then booms because of all the money coming in. It's very easy then to actually, it's cheap to invest and it generates this sense of what is called animal spirits. Okay? Bullish animal spirits among the entrepreneurs. This finance enters some of it into the stock market, but a lot of it into debt markets, directly and indirectly. Okay, so the entry of the foreign portfolio investors then generates a domestic boom in finance, and so suddenly you get the expansion of different kinds of debt as well. So what did we get between 2003 and 2010? Really, we got a debt-driven boom. Okay. And a lot of this debt went into personal housing, retail debt. So the housing market experiences this massive, massive expansion, as you know. All of us who live in cities have felt it. That, suddenly house prices went up by a factor of 20, 30, 40, okay, in many of these cities. So a real estate boom, a construction boom, a stock market boom, of course. But also, this money is now enabling a lot of investment in India. And this investment is further incentivized by the fact that you're getting all this access to cheap resources, cheap land, cheap minerals, cheap forests, etc., etc. Professor Suri mentioned corruption, and he made a very telling point. He said that, whether it is despite or because of neoliberalism, that we've had continued corruption. We haven't had continued, it's an increase, I would say. Of course, nobody's actually measuring it, but what we saw in the 2000s was a dramatic increase in the scale of individual corrupt things. Now, everybody sees this as a sign that the government is corrupt. I don't see it that way. To me, this was a necessary fallout of this economic strategy. Let's put it this way. If your strategy is that you have to incentivize capital, then you have to give them concessions. You have to give them minerals. You have to give them forests. And they'll all say, if you don't, then reforms are stalling. Right? If you don't give them more and more goodies, the reforms are stalling. You have to do the next set of reforms. That's the typical narrative. So you have to give them all these things. So if it's a question of giving away a coal block, and you feel you have to do it because that is your strategy, it's the incentivizing of large capital, or giving away of some mineral resources, you're going to do it anyway. Whether you give it to Mr. Ambani or Mr. Adani or Mr. Tata depends on maybe the cut on the side. But that's a minor cut on the side relative to the broader issue. So seen in this light, corruption was not an unfortunate aspect that a particular party in power had. It is an integral part of this strategy. You would not have got that growth without all those giveaways. It was a devil's bargain, if you like. It was a Faustian pact with capital. We give you all this stuff. Now you, in turn, give us investment and output and economic activity. And of course, it's interesting, everybody also, this is the way the narratives get distorted. Everybody thinks that UPA 1 was very good and UPA 2 was very corrupt. Think of it. Every single one of the major scams that came out in UPA 2 occurred during UPA 1. When all, the world and its brother were singing the praises of the UPA and saying that this is this fantastic growth trajectory and so on and so forth. We are going to find that the NDA regime is no less corrupt. But we'll find that out 5 years from now. We won't find it out today. That's the nature of the delayed recognition of the corruption. Okay? And we know, we can see, the kinds of environmental clearances that are being given today are unbelievable and will clearly, eventually, have to be challenged in the courts, and they will lose. Okay? But that's, as I said, 5 years down the line. So corruption is not, shall we say, this kind of bad thing which is preventing the good stuff of reform from happening. Corruption was a part of this neoliberal strategy, and that reinforces my point. Neoliberalism is not about the withdrawal of the state and replacing, a sort of norm-based with a rule-based regime. Neoliberalism is about putting the interests of large capital first. Okay? And as I said, there is a fundamental philosophy underlying it. Okay, there's another very particular thing though about the recent growth that we've had, and this I believe is what makes India so unusual. And it's only when we understand that we can understand the other weird things I told you about. Like the lack of formal employment, the declining work participation of women, and all of those things. And that is that we in India probably have the most complicated, sophisticated, long historical tradition of discrimination, exclusion, inequality, and hierarchy in the world. If there was the Olympics in this, we would get all the gold medals. In this one, we are really the world leaders in inequality and discrimination because we have every single kind. Okay, we've got caste, we've got gender, we've got religion, we've got ethnic group, we've got language, we've got Then of course we have the class angle, which exists always anyway. Then we have the social kinds, the non-caste, etc., but other kinds of social exclusion, depending on whether you're rural or urban, where you did your schooling, whether you did schooling at all, and so on and so forth. So we have this amazing, amazing palette of hierarchy and discrimination. Now here's the thing. Capitalism doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates within societies, right? Indian capitalism has been systematically using our systems of hierarchy and discrimination for its own accumulation agenda. How does this work? It works in two major ways. One is that there are a whole category of people people who basically politically are voiceless. Many tribals who only find voice when they actually go completely Maoist and extremist, and then the voice is only that, oh, you have to go out there and bash them. But, a whole range of people who don't have voice. Have you noticed how all of these mineral resources that are given away at such cheap prices and so on tend to happen in these backward tribal areas where there's very little development? Because there are people there who have less voice. Have you noticed how when the government of Chhattisgarh decides that a huge tribal area which has been occupied by tribals for 2 centuries has suddenly become a municipality, and so they have no land rights whatsoever and there's no compensation? It happens to tribal communities. So the lack of voice of particular sections is a major element in this enabling of the transfer of resources to the large capital, because it can happen with relatively less noise. It can be controlled and contained. The media is not going to bother with it. Middle class in India is not going to bother with it. It's easy to manage it. The other aspect, the way that this works, is through the labor markets. And the labor markets in India are extraordinary in their ability to somehow soak up all of these various aspects of social discrimination. The ones that I have studied a little bit and I can tell you are really prevalent are caste and gender. Okay? We have one of the highest gender gaps in the world in terms of wages. But we also have, as I told you, this very, very peculiar phenomenon of low and declining female workforce participation. Okay? So, in the last 25 years, female workforce participation was already one of the lowest in India, in the whole of the developing world. It was only 36% according to our sample survey data, which is just about 1/3, tiny, right, of the age group 15 plus. It has fallen to 24% in 2011-12, which is the latest data that we have. A decline in female workforce participation. How can this happen? The economy is growing. How can female workforce participation decline? Many reasons were put to explain it. Most of this decline has occurred in agriculture, women self-employed in agriculture withdrawing from the labor force. But it in general happened across the board. What's going on? Well, it turns out that it's really the way in which we define work and employment. So I told you before that we have this really expansive notion of employment, right? You milk a cow, you do, all of this is, you're a worker. However, a whole bunch of real work that most women in India do, and which is essential for the survival of society and the economy, is not called work. Okay? What is it? Well, the NSS has these two wonderful codes called Code 92 and Code 93. So Code 92 is when you're doing all household and family related work. So everything related to care of the young, the old, the sick, the differently abled, etc. Everything related to cooking, cleaning, food processing, all of the activities without which households would not function. So here's the thing. If you do it within your home, or rather the woman of the house does it within the home, she's not a worker. If you hire someone to do it, that person is a worker. As long as it's kept inside the household, it's not seen as work in India. The minute you hire somebody, yes, they are workers. But because so much of our work is actually kept within households and in unpaid, this is not recognized. Code 93 is even more interesting. Code 93 is all of these activities I mentioned, plus when you have to go and collect fuel wood, you have to go and collect water, maybe you do kitchen gardening, maybe you do poultry farming, maybe you do, you make baskets and you make cloth, or you weave something, or you tutor your kids, or any of that. All of that is Code 93. Also not in the labor force. Imagine. So here you have these two codes of work which is essential, necessary, and you cannot have that society without this work being done. But it's not seen as employment. What's happened to women in India? They have gone from recognized paid work to unrecognized unpaid work. If I look at the definition of work, yes, it's fallen from 36 to 24. If I look at code of this definition plus code 92 and code 93, 85% of women are working. Much more than men, by the way. So women have a higher work participation rate than men when you introduce this code, when you accept that this is also work. Now, what does it mean? It means, first of all, that this big productivity increase that we've been talking about in the aggregate, that's all nonsense, because we're not counting a lot of workers who have been pushed into unpaid. But it also is a real sign of gender oppression in society. You know, whether you recognize the work of women is a pretty good indicator of their status in a society. So it tells you something, that women are not only, that their work is not recognized, but that more and more women are being pushed back into unrecognized. Now, what does this amount to? It amounts to a massive subsidy on the rest of the economy. So large capital is subsidized not only by the state, which is giving all these fiscal incentives, but it is subsidized by the unpaid labor of women. It's got to the point where now the government wants a piece of the action as well. I mean, if the private sector can benefit, why can't we, says the government to itself. So the central government has instituted schemes which employ women at a fraction of the minimum wage, on the grounds that this is actually not really a job, you know, they're just doing this because they like it, and it's a kind of honorarium for their services. Our ICDS scheme, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, runs on Anganwadi workers and Anganwadi helpers who, after massive struggles, are now paid the princely amounts of 3,000 and 1,500 per month. Well below, less than half the minimum wage in every state. Okay? Our National Health Mission runs on the work of ASHAs. It's a really ironic, it's a cruel name actually. Accredited Social Health Activist, in short ASHA, who originally were not supposed to be paid at all. They were just supposed to be given stuff by the community as a kind of, grateful thing. And now are paid 500 in some states and 1,000 rupees in another state. They have 17 functions. It will take all day to fulfill all those functions. But this is what they're paid. And this is the government doing this, using gender discrimination as a means of getting labor on the cheap. All of these are ways that accumulation in India is subsidized. Okay? Caste is another indicator. All the studies that are being done now more and more on caste find that Dalits and certain castes in different states, certain OBCs in different states, invariably end up in lower wage occupations with worse conditions. And that often these jobs are seen as the preserve of those castes. You're going to have Wilson here in the afternoon. He will tell you about the worst forms of these practices. But the point is that it is widespread. And once again, the fact that you have these segmented labor markets allows a subsidy to large capital. All of this is a subsidy to large capital. You know, we are very proud of our software industry. We think it's out California compared to the rest of the sub-Saharan African country that we are and so on. But all of those shiny towers in your IT city or in Bangalore or elsewhere are hugely reliant on these subsidies. It's not just the software engineers, some of you may be in this room, who are cheap by global standards. It is also the fact that that entire industry is subsidized by cheap cleaners, cheap caterers, cheap cooks, cheap security guards, cheap drivers, most of whom are informal workers who do not have any protection. So there is and of course these IT software workers themselves, that is the professionals, can afford to ask for lower wages because they themselves can access these cheaper services back home. So what I'm saying is that a large part of this whole accumulation thing was based on this strategy, this history of discrimination, which enabled large capital to benefit from these subsidies. So now what's the problem? Well, the problem is that all these things are running out. There's a limit now to how much you can keep giving away resources. Either we run out of these resources or the Supreme Court has stepped in and so on. There is a limit to how much you can exploit the differentials based on caste or on gender or community because you've more or less exploited them to the hilt. And of course, all of these strategies turn have meant that you're not putting purchasing power into the hands of most of your people. So there isn't a dynamic internal market. There isn't demand for more stuff happening inside the economy. So this is a strategy that would have petered out, and it has petered out. Same with the debt-driven muscles. You can allow debt to grow and grow and grow. At some point, households will have to repay. And when they can't, then you will get either a crisis or a reduction of these debt levels. And that in turn will reduce consumption. You will have noticed that, again, all these cities that had housing booms are now experiencing housing declines, yeah? With either falling prices or at least no sales occurring. Very few sales occurring. So these are things which, in a sense, these strategies are over. So this is the context in which many of the things we expected would happen, well, at least the reformers expected would happen, didn't happen. It's because Indian capitalism is this peculiar kind of form, and what neoliberalism has done in India is to accentuate these peculiarities of Indian capitalism, to actually make them significantly sharper and worse. It also means that our industrialists are less interested in, if you like, the productivity innovations and investing and so on, because they can, as long as they can continue to take advantage of these, that's what they will go for. That's why something like the land alienation bill is so important. That's why everybody's jumping up and down saying next generation reform has to be the labor market. And that's why they grasp for straws like the GST, which, let me assure you, will not make any difference to the Indian economy in terms of generating more growth and all of that. So we now have a situation where, if you like, the boom generated by neoliberalism has run its course. Unfortunately, we have a government that doesn't seem to have a plan B at all. What it wants to do is more of the same. If you look at the Gujarat model, it was basically that. Give lots of incentives to big companies, even more than nationally. And then hope that they will invest, and that will generate growth. In fact, Gujarat had a low rate of employment growth. Now everybody knows that because of the patidars and others. But people didn't know it when they voted in 2014. They thought, the streets of Gujarat are paved with gold and there are jobs around every corner and everything. So what we have is a government that actually just wants to do more of the same. And now that global capital is more apprehensive, they say, do anything you can to just attract global capital. Say, make in India, say, etc. Do announce a smart cities program. Do a lot of optics in the hope that people will get fooled into investing once again in India. For the last 5 years, private investment in India has been declining. Every single quarter is lower than the previous quarter. For 5 years now, imagine. If your own industrialists are looking for pastures abroad in a gloomy global economy, how come they're not investing in the one bright spot? Then why do we expect global capital to invest in that bright spot? Okay, now essentially what I'm saying therefore is that we have a growth pattern that was based, a growth pattern that was based on inequality, that has further accentuated that inequality and has now run out of steam. On the other hand, we also have a demography which we earlier thought was a big advantage, but we now are recognizing that it could well be a disaster. It is a ticking time bomb because we have a large generation of young people entering the labor market, many of whom have undergone tertiary education. We have 50 million more young people with tertiary education now in 5 years. Okay? 2/3 of that education is private. They're going to various teaching shops, engineering colleges, degree colleges, what have you. Some of them are selling family land, some of them are taking on debt in the hope that this will improve their employment prospects. And yet we have an economy that will not generate formal jobs. So what this phase of neoliberalism has done is also leave us with a very disconcerting legacy, in fact a very worrying legacy. Because we now are faced with a very, very big problem in terms of the continuing inequality, the combination of aspirations and expectations that have been generated by the political system as well, which are unlikely to be met. And all of you know, this is a recipe for the nastier kinds of social tension. I don't have to tell you the forms this will take. We all experience too many of them already. I think that's why a seminar like this is so important. And I'm so happy that there are young people here because, I don't want this to be gloom and doom. I have to tell you that always in these situations, there are different paths that can be taken. It's not there is no alternative situation. There are always different strategies, and governments do not choose strategies on their own. They have to be forced into it. And they're only forced into it by popular movements. And so it is only popular movements that can force a change in direction. But I think if people begin to see the nature of that growth and what has to be done instead, then it is actually easier to force a change in course. Okay, thank you very much.